Among the most harrowing aspects of the Vietnam War for U.S. forces was the capture and treatment of American POWs, American servicemen, particularly pilots shot down during bombing missions, were at constant risk of being captured by the Vietcong. Let's get to know a little bit about the conflict first. The Vietnam War, or the Second Indochina War, was one of the most defining and protracted conflicts of the 20th century. Lasting nearly 2 decades, it became emblematic of the ideological struggle that characterized the Cold War era. This brutal and divisive conflict pitted the communist forces of North Vietnam, supported by the Soviet Union, China, and other Eastern Bloc nations, against the anti-communist forces of South Vietnam, heavily backed by the United States and allied countries like Australia, South Korea, and Thailand. The war's origins were deeply tied to Vietnam's colonial history and the global tensions of the Cold War. After World War II, Vietnam declared independence from French colonial rule under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh. However, the French sought to reassert control, resulting in the First Indochina War. That conflict ended with the Geneva Accords of 1954, which temporarily divided Vietnam along the 17th parallel. North Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh and the communist Viet Minh was established as a communist state. South Vietnam, led by the anti-communist government of Ngo Dinh Diem, was backed by Western powers, claimed to represent a democratic alternative. The division, intended as a temporary measure until national elections could be held, quickly solidified into a deeper ideological and geopolitical rift. North Vietnam, with its vision of reunification under communist rule, sought to destabilize and overthrow the government in the South. South Vietnam, in turn, depended heavily on the U.S. military and economic aid to maintain its sovereignty. Central to North Vietnam's strategy was the Vietcong, officially known as the National Liberation Front. Formed in 1960, the Vietcong represented South Vietnamese communists and anti-government rebels who sought to overthrow the U.S.-supported regime in Saigon. They operated as a guerrilla force, employing unconventional warfare tactics that maximized the advantage of their local knowledge and resourcefulness. Guerrilla warfare became the hallmark of the Viet Cong's operations. Their tactics included ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and the use of booby traps, such as punji sticks and hidden explosives, which caused significant casualties among American and South Vietnamese forces. The dense jungles of Vietnam were their ally, providing cover for their movements and making it exceedingly difficult for conventional forces to engage them effectively. The Viet Cong also relied on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a sophisticated network of supply routes that ran through Laos and Cambodia. This trail allowed North Vietnam to transport troops, weapons, and supplies to the Viet Cong in the south, bypassing conventional battlefronts and frustrating U.S. attempts to sever the North's support line. Despite relentless bombing campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder, the Ho Chi Minh Trail proved nearly impossible to destroy entirely, reflecting the resilience and ingenuity of the Viet Cong and their allies. The Vietnam was catastrophic for both Vietnam and the United States. For Vietnam, the human toll was staggering. Over 3 million Vietnamese, including civilians, lost their lives. Entire villages were just wiped out, and millions were displaced, their homes destroyed in the crossfire of combat or in U.S. bombing campaigns targeting communist strongholds. The use of chemical agents like Agent Orange caused long-term environmental damage and severe health consequences for the population, including birth defects and chronic illnesses that persist to this day. For the United States, the war marked a deeply divisive chapter in its history. More than 58,000 American soldiers were killed, and hundreds of thousands more were wounded, both physically and psychologically. The war presented unprecedented dangers for American servicemen, particularly those captured by enemy forces. Among the approximately 766 military personnel taken as prisoners of war, many were aviators conducting high-risk bombing missions over North Vietnam. These missions, which were part of the broader U.S. strategy of aerial bombardment campaigns like Operation Rolling Thunder, exposed pilots to relentless anti-aircraft fire, surface-to-air missiles, and fighter interceptions. The risks were immense, and when their aircrafts were shot down, challenges only intensified. For aviators shot down over North Vietnam, the ordeal began the moment their planes were hit. Ejecting from a crippled aircraft was itself a perilous process, with risk of injury from shrapnel, extreme wind forces, or faulty parachutes. Once on the ground, the downed airmen faced a hostile and volatile environment. North Vietnamese soldiers were often the first to reach crash sites, but local villagers also played a role in apprehending pilots. Enraged by the destruction caused by the U.S. bombing raids, civilians would sometimes beat or injure captured Americans before turning them over to the military authorities. For those unlucky enough to be captured, the journey to a detention facility marked the beginning of a long and grueling ordeal. Many POWs were paraded through villages as propaganda tools, enduring jeers, physical abuse, and public humiliation before being transported to prisons. Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr. was one of the earliest and most notable American POWs. On August 5, 1964, Alvarez was flying his A-4 Skyhawk on a bombing mission near Haiphong when his aircraft was hit by North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire. Ejecting from his plane, Alvarez landed in enemy territory and was promptly captured. Held in captivity for 8 years and 7 months, Alvarez endured what would become one of the longest periods of confinement for any American POW in history. For the North Vietnamese, the capture of American servicemen served multiple purposes beyond merely detaining enemy combatants. American POWs were exploited as tools of psychological warfare and propaganda, used to demoralize U.S. forces and bolster the North Vietnamese narrative of resistance against American imperialism. Captured airmen were often coerced into making statements, condemning U.S. politics, or admitting to alleged war crimes during carefully staged press conferences or filmed interviews. These confessions were rarely genuine. Instead, they were extracted under duress, often through physical and psychological torture. The North Vietnamese disseminated these materials both domestically and internationally to sway public opinion and portray the U.S. military as aggressors. The capture of American servicemen often led to harrowing experiences. Those taken in the field by the Vietcong were transported through dense jungles to hidden camps, where conditions were deplorable. Others captured by the North Vietnamese Army were sent to larger, established prisons in Hanoi or other cities. Qua Lo Prison, known to the world by its grim moniker, the Hanoi Hilton, stands as a chilling symbol of the cruelty faced by American POWs. While its original purpose as a French-built detention facility for political dissidents reflected the oppression of colonial rule, its use by North Vietnamese during the war to house captured U.S. servicemen revealed a new, harrowing chapter of suffering and endurance. Constructed in the late 19th century, the facility was built with thick stone walls that towered over its surroundings, heavy iron gates that slammed shut with finality, and narrow, barred windows that allowed only slivers of light into its dim interiors. These features created an oppressive atmosphere that both physically confined and psychologically tormented the inmates. The prison cells varied in size, but were universally cramped and dehumanizing. Many prisoners were shackled to the floor or to iron rings embedded in the walls, restricting movement and forcing them into painful positions for hours and days on end. The solitary confinement cells, designed to isolate and break the spirit of the most defiant inmates, were particularly notorious. These cells were small, dark, and devoid of ventilation, often leaving their occupants in suffocating heat and complete isolation from the outside world. The sanitary conditions were abysmal, bordering on inhumane. Toilets were rudimentary holes in the ground that were rarely cleaned, leading to an overwhelming stench that filled the prison. The presence of rats, insects, and other vermin added to the filth and squalor. Bathing and personal hygiene were luxuries rarely afforded to prisoners, who often went weeks without being allowed to clean themselves or their clothing. As a result, many suffered from skin infections, open sores, and infestations of lice and other parasites. The food provided at Hoa Lo was deliberately insufficient, designed to weaken prisoners both physically and mentally. The staple diet consisted of thin, watery soup made from inedible weeds, and occasionally portions of rice. Even these meager meals were often contaminated, either intentionally or due to neglect with dirt, sand, and insects. Prisoners frequently found maggots or other vermin in their food, adding to the humiliation and torment. This grossly inadequate diet resulted in widespread malnutrition, leaving prisoners in a perpetual state of weakness. Vitamin deficiencies became common, leading to diseases like beriberi, characterized by extreme fatigue and swelling, and scurvy, which caused several dental problems, bleeding gums, and joint pain. The lack of protein and essential nutrients also contributed to weakened immune systems, making prisoners more susceptible to infections and diseases like dysentery and respiratory illnesses. From the moment they arrived, POWs were subjected to harsh confinement and rigid control. Guards imposed draconian rules, forbidding any form of communication between prisoners. Even a whisper or a glance could result in brutal punishment. The constant surveillance by both guards and the ever-present threat of informers created an atmosphere of paranoia and isolation. The psychological toll of being unable to communicate with others was immense, as isolation is often used to break a prisoner's resolve. For prisoners, simply staying sane in such an environment was an incredible challenge. One of the most extraordinary ways POWs maintained communication in such a restrictive environment was through the tap code, a covert system of knocks and taps that allowed them to send messages through the walls of their cells. The tap code was based on a simple substitution cipher, where each letter of the alphabet was assigned a series of taps in a rhythmic pattern. Using a coded pattern of knocks, prisoners were able to communicate with one another in total secrecy. The tap code was not only a lifeline for maintaining contact and sharing information, but it also helped prisoners emotionally support one another. In a setting where everything was designed to isolate them from their comrades, the tap code became a tool for solidarity, reinforcing the bonds of friendship and shared experience that sustained the prisoners through their ordeal. Prisoners could send brief messages of encouragement, check on the well-being of others, and offer support, even if they were unable to see each other or speak aloud. It also allowed them to stay informed about each other's captivity, providing vital moral support during long periods of silence and isolation. Some prisoners turned to mental exercises to combat the crushing boredom and isolation. These exercises helped to preserve their mental acuity and prevent their minds from descending into despair. For example, some POWs would memorize poems and passages from books, or even create mental puzzles to keep their minds engaged. One well-known example was a POW who memorized entire novels, repeating them over and over in his mind to stay focused and distracted from the suffering around him. Others constructed elaborate imaginary structures or mental walls, envisioning buildings or landscapes to maintain a sense of control over their environment. This mental resistance was crucial, as it allowed prisoners to exercise their willpower and imagination in a way that helped them feel less passive in the face of their captors' brutality. Another form of resistance was the use of false information. POWs would often provide their captors with deliberately incorrect answers during interrogations, feeding them misleading or absurd details. This was a form of rebellion. By denying the enemy any useful intelligence, they denied them the satisfaction of forcing a confession. Sometimes the false information was humorous or absurd, with prisoners incorporating sarcasm, exaggeration, or even outright absurdities into their answers. This not only undermined the captors' efforts, but also preserved the POW's sense of control over their own fate. By refusing to provide meaningful answers, prisoners effectively neutralized the North Vietnamese interrogation efforts. Some prisoners even used the opportunity to turn the interrogations into a form of psychological warfare, sometimes attempting to manipulate their interrogators or maintain control of the conversation, thus preserving some psychological advantage. For some prisoners, faith became a cornerstone of survival. Prayer, whether in private or shared through quiet gestures like crossing one's fingers, became a source of solace for many. Even in such extreme isolation, many found comfort in the belief that they were not truly alone, even if they could not communicate with others. Some prisoners even found ways to hold clandestine religious services, providing a sense of shared spirituality and community that was vital for maintaining hope. The physical torture methods employed by the North Vietnamese were brutal, often causing lasting injuries and long-term trauma. One of the most famous and excruciating techniques was the rope trick. In this method, a prisoner's arms were bound tightly behind their back and then hoisted upward. The ropes were pulled so tightly that they dislocated the shoulders and caused intense, almost unbearable pain. This method left lasting damage to the shoulders, often causing permanent dislocation and nerve damage. Beatings were another regular form of physical punishment. Prisoners were frequently struck with whips, bamboo sticks, and fists, particularly targeting the head, torso, and limbs. These beatings were not intended simply to inflict pain, but to break the spirit of the prisoner, forcing them into submission. The head was often targeted because of the psychological and physical impact of blunt trauma to the skull. Many prisoners returned home with permanent physical damage from the constant battering, including fractured bones, concussions, and long-term neurological disorders. Another horrific method involved twisted handcuffs. These were applied so tightly that they would cut off circulation, causing excruciating pain as the nerves were pinched and blood flow was obstructed. Over time, this could lead to irreversible nerve damage, deformity, and atrophy in the hands and arms, leaving prisoners with permanent disability and pain. The physical damage inflicted on prisoners during these torturous practices was compounded by a lack of medical treatment, leaving many to suffer without any chance of recovery. Sleep deprivation was a common tactic. Prisoners were kept awake for extended periods, often by loud noises or bright lights. This lack of sleep, combined with the constant stress of interrogation, left prisoners mentally exhausted and vulnerable. Prisoners were also subjected to extreme temperature exposure, either through being kept in sweltering heat or placed in freezing cold conditions for prolonged periods. The North Vietnamese hoped that these conditions would induce confusion and desperation, forcing prisoners to make mistakes or give in to their captors' demands. One of the most insidious aspects of the torture was the use of POWs for propaganda. The North Vietnamese often sought to exploit their prisoners for international and domestic political gain. Prisoners were coerced into signing false confessions in which they admitted to war crimes, denounced U.S. military actions, or made public statements supporting the North Vietnamese government. These confessions were then broadcast on television, in newspapers, and in radio broadcasts, used to show that even American soldiers had turned against their government. For many POWs, including prominent figures like Senator John McCain, the pressure to cooperate with their captors was immense. McCain, who had been shot down in October 1967 and captured by the North Vietnamese, was tortured for 5.5 years. His refusal to cooperate became legendary, but it came at an enormous personal cost. During his captivity, McCain endured countless beatings, torture sessions, and psychological abuse, leaving him with permanent injuries, including lasting damage to his shoulders, arms, and legs. His inability to sign a confession, despite being offered early release in exchange for propaganda cooperation, became a point of honor, and his refusal to betray his comrades symbolized the deep strength of the human spirit under unimaginable pressure. Despite the brutal conditions, American POWs displayed extraordinary resilience and defiance. Richard Davis Winters, born on January 21, 1918 in New Holland, Pennsylvania, was an emblem of courage and effective leadership long before the Vietnam War. After graduating from Franklin and Marshall College in 1941, Winters enlisted in the U.S. Army, where he would eventually rise to prominence as the commander of Easy Company within the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. Winters' leadership was most notably displayed during the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944. Tasked with the mission to neutralize a German artillery battery at Brecourt Manor, Winters led a small group of men in a daring assault that successfully eliminated the threat to Allied forces landing on Utah Beach. His tactical brilliance during this operation earned him the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration awarded by the United States. Winters' approach to leadership was characterized by his calm demeanor, strategic thinking, and unwavering dedication to his men. His actions throughout the war, including during Operation Market Garden and the Battle of the Bulge, cemented his reputation as an inspirational figure in military history. His story was later immortalized in Stephen E. Ambrose's book, Band of Brothers, and the acclaimed HBO miniseries of the same name. While Richard Winters and the American POWs of the Vietnam War faced vastly different challenges, their stories are united by a common theme: the triumph of the human spirit in the face of adversity.